Okay, so
Unreal.
you touched on something I wanted to explore, which is Sylvie's internal harshness, right? And
Right.
and this is something where I relate to very deeply with Sylvie.
Oh,
you
oh,
know,
I'm sorry to hear that because that is a heavy burden. That is a heavy burden.
it is an incredible gift and a big burden, right? It is. I
Yeah,
find
it's true.
that
It's true.
I
It's true.
find that a lot of the things that I've been able to accomplish in life, and the reason why I'm able to be very valuable to a lot of people,
Mm,
is because I've pushed myself so relentlessly my entire life
yeah.
forward. And with that comes a strength and an ability to carry responsibility or to burden things that
Mm,
helps the world and helps lots of people.
yeah.
But for your inner happiness, it is not necessarily
No.
like
No.
the greatest path. It doesn't lead to any kind of
No.
inner peace or
It's
happiness.
very, very, very hard. Which is part of my respect for her too, and my respect
Mhm.
for you. If
Mhm.
you carry that harshness of criticism towards yourself, it is unending, relentless, and this is part of why one thing that I do is you talk about how in fighting we don't really focus too much on the physical thing, like keep the hand up or do
Mhm.
this thing, because for a critical person like her and possibly you, if you concretize something too much, it is going to lock up.
Mhm.
It is it is counterproductive. And Sylvia learned this herself. She's spoken of it in fights. If she goes into a fight and she's like, just do these three things: throw a jab, move. I don't know what the third one would be. She would do none of them. And
Mhm.
the more she tried to fix some concrete thing, the more she would lock up. And it took her over 100 fights to realize you cannot do that. And so what
Mhm.
I have generally done is long wave, long wave achievement. And that's why we're like 100 fights, 200 fights. Screw trying to win some belt somewhere that doesn't really matter to anybody. Let's try to do these very long wave runs to keep us out of these things that lock up when you get really critical of yourself. And we have a phrase that we use like water over the stone.
Mhm.
It's just like, don't worry about how you performed. It's water over the stone, water over the stone. So that's why I'm like 267 fights. It's just the beginning because
Mhm.
we are thinking in very long waves
Mhm.
but for that reason, because of the harshness of self-critique is just crushing.
I've watched Sylvie's kind of earlier footage when she was training or fighting, and more recently, and in that kind of harsh back and forth context, you can sense a difference. She is a lot more. She seems a lot more relaxed. She still seems very self-critical, but less so.
Yeah,
Like there's a bit of a more relaxed energy to it. And in fighting, and I learned this myself. And like I know nothing about fighting. I've been training for a couple of years, but I've never fought really. But
yet.
I've observed this yet. I've observed this myself, where one of the biggest things slowing down my development was the way how much I was in my head and how much criticism was going on during
Yes,
training, right? And
yes.
also from day one, I can't help it. I would compare my performance on day one with pro fighters that
Yeah,
are like legends. And then I'd
yes,
be like, well, I am just the worst person to ever do this. And here's
yes,
the 300 things I can point out that I did wrong. And
yes,
all that does is it tenses you up, it
yes,
overwhelms you, and it
yes.
slows you down, right?
100%.
And it took me many years. It actually also took me an LSD experience, to be honest.
Uh,
I
yeah.
had to be on acid once while watching fights, and then get into like a flow of
Oh,
shadow boxing,
yes.
where I saw my body move freely, without any
Um,
self-criticism, with any slowdown. And I was like, wow, I didn't know that I can already do much more than I thought I
exactly.
can when I'm not tensing up so
Yes.
much, when I'm not holding back so much. And that really changed. There was a before and after. When you saw me inspiring before, I was very tense and very
Mm,
self in my head.
mm,
And afterwards, I moved much more freely, loosely. You would have the impression that I was comfortable and having fun, versus before you'd had
Yes.
the impression that I'm really stressed out about the situation.
Yes.
And what I'm curious about is that journey. I mean, you've been kind of an influence of taking away some of the dark clouds, pointing in a
Yeah.
very long-term direction. But were there maybe inflection points, moments that clicked for Sylvie, or that you observed where you saw it before and after and said, oh, this fight or this conversation or this
Yes.
moment made her relax a little bit more? What were the
Well,
stones?
she talks about the biggest stone that just flipped things around, where, and if you follow our content, you probably heard her talk about it, but we had just moved to Pattaya after 2 years in Chiang Mai. Sylvie had already had like 75 or 80 fights, which already was just like an unheard of number. So when you fight so much, you're supposed to be really good, like all the self-criticism, blah, 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 blah. And she had just moved to Pattaya with a new gym here, and she fought a local star, Cherry Sityeodong, and she got destroyed. And it was embarrassing. Like, Sylvie has great pride, actually, which is actually part of some of her most difficult qualities, is that pride can hold her very harshly towards herself. So she actually, at that point, had, I think it was 3 days later, which is very rare, another fight scheduled against a Japanese world champion, Sai Ito, in Bangkok on the biggest show of the year. And she had never been on such a show. And she was basically, there's nothing I can do physically to change myself from that horrible, embarrassing fight with my new gym in my corner to fighting a world champion who everybody called the Phenom on television. And she finally embraced mental training. And for the longest time, she knew mental training was what you needed to do, visualization and everything. And she just said, fuck it, I'm going to dive in. And for 3 days, I don't think it was actually the mental training so much, but rather she let go. She was just like, I cannot control my performance. And she got a couple of really good tips, breathing exercises, simple visualizations, and she won that next fight. And it was a huge victory. And that was a turning point. Was the first time that she felt, I think she would speak for herself, but I think she felt, wow, maybe I am among one of the better fighters at my weight in the world, because she didn't believe that at all at that point. And that was a huge point. And other inflection points, that was some years ago. That was many, many years ago, like maybe 6 years ago. And I'm trying to think of another inflection point, like, I don't know, my mind is blanking on it because
No
there's
worries.
so many fights, many. Another, this is a separate one, but, and you follow us, so you would know this, but when COVID hit, we were like, well, Sylvie's famous for fighting more than anybody. She would fight more than 30 times a year, and there weren't going to be fights. And that's when we made a decision that we're going to just go to what we call Sylvie 3.0, which is a completely different fighter, and take the next year, and maybe she won't fight at all. It's not even been a year since that happened. And we made a firm commitment to sparring a ton. Like, Sylvie always didn't like sparring. It made her feel bad. It built a lot of negative thoughts about herself, like you said, a lot of self-criticism. But my theory was, and still is, that the reason why she's so tense in fighting, beside the fact she's much smaller than almost all of her opponents, is she does not have the eyes to see what's coming. And it's like, if you're walking in a room that's dark and there's furniture, you're gonna be tense. You're gonna bang your shin. Things are gonna come where you don't expect them. So we devoted this entire year to growing eyes, being able to see in the dark, under the theory that when you can see, the organism is gonna relax. And that's what you're seeing when you say that there's a difference. And it's
Mhm.
still, we're just in the beginning stages of that, but it's made a huge difference because things slow down. The organism can perceive things moving through space. You're not being shocked and stunned by what just hit you. And it's a very big part of, that was a big turning point that Sylvie just finally was like, I'll give into this. And so she's been sparring like an unbelievable amount.
It's